Snow drifted across the iron gates of Ashcombe Palace, softening the sharp edges of towers that overlooked a sleeping valley. Lanterns glowed along the winding drive as gilded carriages rolled through the entrance, delivering nobles wrapped in velvet, jewels, and effortless confidence. Inside, servants hurried across polished marble floors with silver trays and towering floral arrangements, preparing for the grand winter banquet that would gather the kingdom's wealthiest families beneath one magnificent roof. Every corridor shimmered with candlelight, every crystal chandelier reflected 100 tiny suns, and every smile concealed ambition. Among the bustling servants moved Clara Whitmore, carefully balancing a tray despite the weight of 7 months of pregnancy. At 22, she possessed quiet beauty untouched by vanity, though exhaustion had left faint shadows beneath her gray-blue eyes. Her simple brown dress had been altered countless times to fit her growing belly, yet she still carried herself with gentle dignity. Every careful step reminded her of the tiny heartbeat depending entirely upon her strength. She ignored the ache in her back, whispered silent encouragement to her unborn child, and continued working before anyone noticed she had paused. Most servants pitied Clara, but pity rarely protected anyone inside great houses. A pair of younger maids exchanged knowing glances as she passed. "I still cannot believe she dares remain here," one whispered. "The child has no father anyone has seen," replied the other. Clara heard every word. She lowered her eyes without answering, choosing silence over another useless defense. Rumors had become part of her daily labor, heavier than any tray she carried. Mrs. Agnes Holloway, the stern housekeeper, appeared at the end of the corridor with a ledger pressed beneath one arm. Her sharp gaze swept across every servant before settling on Clara. "You should be resting." "There is too much to finish," Clara answered softly. Mrs. Holloway sighed, pretending annoyance while discreetly taking the heavier tray from Clara's trembling hands. "Carry linens instead. If anyone asks, I ordered it." It was the closest thing to kindness the older woman ever allowed herself in public. Outside the kitchens, old gardener Thomas Bennet struggled with a basket overflowing with winter roses meant for the ballroom. Several stems spilled across the frozen path. Before anyone else reacted, Clara carefully knelt despite the strain in her body and gathered every flower. "You'll catch cold, child," Thomas murmured. "I'll be warmer helping than standing still." His weathered face softened. "Your mother used to say exactly that." Clara smiled sadly. Her parents had been gone for years, leaving little beyond fading memories and unanswered questions. Thomas watched her disappear inside, silently wondering how much longer goodness could survive surrounded by cruelty. High above the entrance hall, Duke Adrian Ashcombe overlooked the preparations from a carved balcony. Tall and composed, he wore authority as naturally as others wore silk. Since the war that had claimed so many loyal soldiers, he had buried himself in duty, believing discipline could silence grief. His steward discussed guest lists beside him, but Adrian's attention drifted downward when he noticed Clara helping an elderly scullery maid lift a bucket much too heavy for either of them. "Who is she?" Adrian asked. "A servant named Clara Whitmore." "The pregnant one?" "Yes, Your Grace." His steward expected nothing further. Instead, Adrian remained watching until Clara disappeared around a corner, puzzled by the quiet strength hidden beneath such obvious hardship. Not everyone overlooked her so gently. Lady Vivian Blackwood arrived before sunset in a sapphire gown trimmed with silver embroidery, drawing admiring glances wherever she walked. Beautiful, poised, and calculating, she believed herself destined to become Duchess of Ashcombe. The sight of Adrian's lingering attention toward an insignificant servant stirred immediate resentment. She approached Clara just as another maid accidentally dropped a stack of folded tablecloths. "What happened here?" Vivian demanded. The frightened maid burst into tears. Clara stepped forward. "It was my mistake, my lady." Vivian's smile never reached her eyes. "Then you may spend the evening polishing every staircase before assisting in the ballroom." Without protest, Clara bowed her head. After darkness settled over the estate, Clara quietly slipped beyond the servants' entrance carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. 3 hungry village children waited beneath an old oak tree, shivering against the wind. She divided her untouched supper between them, laughing softly as the youngest proudly offered her half a crust in return. "You need it more," the little boy insisted. "So do you," Clara replied, breaking the bread into equal pieces. When the children hurried home, she remained alone beneath the falling snow. Reaching inside her dress, she drew out a worn gold wedding ring hanging from a ribbon around her neck. Tears gathered as she pressed it against her lips. "I promised I would keep believing," she whispered. Behind an upstairs window, unseen by Clara, Adrian had stepped onto the balcony for fresh air. Across the courtyard, he watched the lonely servant cradle the hidden ring with heartbreaking tenderness, unaware that the silent grief frozen upon her face was about to alter both their lives forever. Morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky, and Ashcombe Palace awakened long before dawn. Bells echoed through the servants' quarters, summoning every pair of willing hands to prepare for the grand winter banquet. Fires roared inside enormous kitchens while cooks argued over sauces, bakers carried fragrant loaves from glowing ovens, and footmen polished silver until every surface reflected dancing flames. Clara rose carefully from her narrow bed before the other maids stirred, pressing one hand against the small of her aching back and the other over her unborn daughter. The baby responded with a gentle kick, drawing the first genuine smile across Clara's face that morning. She whispered, "Just one more difficult day, little one. We'll get through it together." The comforting words faded as soon as she entered the palace corridors. Servants rushed in every direction, each carrying impossible lists of duties. Mrs. Holloway distributed assignments with military precision, pausing briefly when Clara approached. "You'll arrange flowers in the East Gallery first," she instructed quietly. "Avoid carrying anything heavier than necessary." Before Clara could thank her, Lady Vivian stepped gracefully into the corridor, her polished boots clicking against the marble floor. "I believe the housekeeper has forgotten who gives orders inside my family's residence," Vivian said sweetly. Mrs. Holloway remained expressionless. "The Duke gives orders." Vivian's smile sharpened. "Until he returns from inspecting the Western estate this afternoon, I expect every servant to obey me." She turned toward Clara with calculated satisfaction. "The ballroom fireplaces need fresh logs every hour. The crystal chandeliers require polishing. Every staircase must be scrubbed before sunset. Since you insisted yesterday that you were healthy enough to work, surely none of that will trouble you." Mrs. Holloway opened her mouth to object. Clara gently shook her head before the older woman could speak. "I'll finish everything." Vivian walked away pleased, knowing the assignments bordered on impossible even for servants in perfect health. Hours passed beneath relentless labor. Clara hauled baskets of firewood across endless corridors, stopping only when dizziness blurred her vision. She polished brass railings until her fingertips reddened and climbed staircase after staircase with measured determination, refusing to let anyone witness her struggle. Whenever sharp discomfort tightened across her stomach, she rested one hand against the polished banister and breathed slowly until the pain eased. No complaint escaped her lips. Near midday, disaster struck inside the great dining hall. A frightened kitchen boy stumbled while carrying an enormous tureen of steaming soup, sending it crashing across the polished floor. Silence swallowed the room. The head chef stormed forward. Who distracted him? The trembling boy stared helplessly at the broken dishes. Without hesitation, Clara stepped between them. "It was my fault. I should have seen him coming." The chef glared furiously. "You've wasted hours of work. I'll clean everything." He thrust a bucket into her hands before walking away muttering bitterly. The kitchen boy looked ready to cry. "Why did you say that?" he whispered. "Because mistakes shouldn't decide someone's future," Clara answered with a tired smile. The boy silently resolved never to forget her kindness. Late that afternoon, Duke Adrian returned unexpectedly. Snow dusted his dark coat as he crossed the entrance hall, removing leather gloves while exchanging reports with his steward. His conversation stopped the instant he noticed Clara struggling beneath an armful of heavy firewood nearly as large as herself. "What happened?" he asked. The steward hesitated. Lady Vivian adjusted today's assignments. Adrian frowned. Who approved that? No one, Your Grace. Before Adrian could continue, Clara lost her balance. Several logs scattered across the marble floor with a thunderous crash. Every nearby servant froze. Adrian instinctively stepped forward, offering his hand before she could struggle upright alone. Are you injured? She looked startled that the Duke himself had spoken to her. No, Your Grace. Only clumsy. He glanced toward the fallen wood, then toward her swollen belly. I doubt clumsiness is the problem. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat before Clara quietly gathered the scattered logs herself, unwilling to burden anyone further. From across the hall, Vivian watched the exchange with rising alarm. That evening the palace transformed into breathtaking splendor. Hundreds of candles illuminated towering windows while musicians rehearsed elegant waltzes beneath painted ceilings. Crystal goblets sparkled upon endless banquet tables, and fragrant winter roses filled every corner with delicate perfume. Guests began arriving in dazzling gowns and embroidered uniforms, laughing as servants accepted cloaks and announced illustrious names. Clara adjusted the plain apron covering her dress before lifting another silver tray. Mrs. Holloway quietly touched her arm. If anything feels wrong tonight, come find me. I'll manage. You always do. As Clara entered the magnificent ballroom, whispers followed almost immediately. Curious eyes drifted toward her rounded belly before returning to jeweled conversations disguised as polite smiles. She ignored every stare, concentrating instead on serving wine with steady hands. Across the room, Adrian noticed those glances as well, his expression hardening with each passing moment. Vivian observed him watching Clara once again, and a dangerous idea slowly formed behind her graceful smile. Before the orchestra played its opening note, she summoned several influential ladies together and began whispering something that made them laugh while repeatedly glancing toward the unsuspecting servant standing alone beside the glittering ballroom doors. Music blossomed beneath the soaring ceiling as violins welcomed the first dancers onto the polished ballroom floor. Noble women floated through the candlelit hall in shimmering gowns embroidered with silver thread, while gentlemen exchanged confident smiles behind jeweled masks. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across marble pillars, transforming the palace into a dream crafted from gold and glass. Servants moved silently among the guests with practiced precision, invisible unless something went wrong. Clara reminded herself that invisibility was often the safest place to be. She balanced a silver tray filled with sparkling glasses and crossed the room with measured steps, careful not to jar the child resting beneath her heart. Every laugh that echoed around her seemed impossibly distant from the quiet determination keeping her upright. She focused on breathing, on serving, on reaching the next table without drawing attention. It was a simple goal, yet tonight the ballroom felt filled with watchful eyes. Lady Vivian stood near the grand staircase surrounded by elegant companions who admired her effortless charm. She smiled graciously whenever anyone looked her way, but the sweetness vanished each time her gaze drifted toward Clara. Seeing Adrian noticed the servant earlier had planted a thorn in her pride, and pride demanded satisfaction. My friends, Vivian said softly to the ladies gathered beside her, have you noticed how remarkably fearless some servants become when they believe sympathy excuses disgrace? One woman raised an eyebrow. You mean the pregnant girl? The very one. I heard she refuses to name the father. Vivian sighed theatrically. How unfortunate for the child. One can only imagine the sort of man willing to abandon her. Another lady laughed. Perhaps there were several. The group erupted into amused whispers, each cruel remark feeding the next until gossip became entertainment. Their voices never rose enough to disturb the music, yet they carried just far enough for Clara to hear fragments as she passed. She kept walking. She had learned long ago that answering cruelty rarely silenced it. Across the ballroom Adrian greeted influential guests with practiced courtesy, but his attention repeatedly returned to the same quiet servant moving through the crowd. He noticed how she lowered her eyes whenever laughter followed her, how she thanked even the rudest guests for empty glasses, and how she subtly supported the small of her back whenever no one seemed to notice. Strength without complaint always impressed him more than loud displays of confidence. Thomas entered the ballroom carrying fresh roses for the central arrangements. As he replaced several fading blooms, he caught Clara's eye and offered the faintest encouraging smile. She answered with one of her own before continuing her duties. The brief exchange reminded Thomas painfully of her parents, whose kindness had survived hardship until their final days. Near the musician's platform, a richly dressed nobleman accepted a glass of wine from Clara, then deliberately brushed her wrist hard enough to make crimson liquid spill across her apron. "Oh dear," he said with exaggerated innocence. "Your condition appears to affect your balance." Several nearby guests chuckled. Clara bowed her head. "I apologize, my lord." She reached for a cloth, intending to clean the stain before it spread, but another noblewoman stepped directly into her path. "You should apologize to the child instead," she remarked coolly. "Imagine beginning life surrounded by scandal." Laughter rippled through the circle. Clara's fingers tightened around the cloth until her knuckles whitened, yet her voice remained calm. "My child will begin life surrounded by love." The noblewoman smirked. "Love? From whom?" No answer came. Clara quietly moved away before tears could betray her. Mrs. Holloway watched from across the hall, unable to intervene without creating greater trouble. Every instinct urged her to protect the young servant, but years of service had taught her that reckless courage sometimes harmed the innocent more than the guilty. Vivian sensed hesitation among the guests and decided whispers alone were insufficient. She gracefully raised her voice just enough for nearby conversations to falter. "Poor Clara works so diligently despite carrying such mysterious circumstances. Surely someone should collect donations for the poor abandoned mother." Coins clinked onto a nearby table as one gentleman laughed and tossed several pieces of silver toward Clara. Another followed. Soon more coins scattered across the polished floor around her feet. "Take them," someone called mockingly. "You'll need them." Another voice added, "Perhaps enough to purchase the father's name." Laughter swelled through the ballroom like a cruel tide. Clara stared at the glittering coins without moving. Every insult struck harder than the last, yet she refused to surrender the dignity they wished to steal. A sharp pain suddenly gripped her lower back. She inhaled slowly. "Not now. Please." Another wave followed, stronger than before. She steadied herself against a carved pillar, willing the discomfort to fade before anyone noticed. Instead, her vision blurred. The silver tray slipped from her trembling fingers. Crystal shattered across the marble with a deafening crash. Music stopped instantly. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the sound. Silence spread across the ballroom. Clara instinctively bent down, trying to gather broken glass before anyone could step upon it. As she lowered herself, another painful contraction stole her breath. She remained kneeling, one hand pressed against the floor, the other protectively covering her stomach. To the watching crowd, it appeared she had finally accepted the mockery. A gentleman laughed first. "Look! She's collecting the coins." More laughter erupted. Someone applauded sarcastically. Another guest nudged a silver piece closer with the tip of his polished boot. "Don't leave any behind." Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to stand. She truly did. But pain rooted her where she knelt. Tears slipped silently onto the marble. Not because of the laughter. Not because of the insults. Because she feared the stress might harm the tiny life depending on her. She whispered so softly only she could hear. "Please stay safe." Above the crowd, Adrian had witnessed everything from the moment the first coin struck the floor. His jaw tightened with every cruel laugh, every smug smile, every silent spectator who chose comfort over compassion. The memory of another loyal soul abandoned by others stirred painfully inside him, awakening guilt he had buried since the war. Without waiting for explanation or permission, he descended the grand staircase one measured step at a time. Conversation died as guests realized where the Duke was walking. Not toward the honored nobles. Not toward Lady Vivian. toward the pregnant servant still kneeling among shattered crystal and scattered silver. Vivian's confident smile slowly disappeared. She suddenly understood she had misjudged Adrian completely. The final distance seemed to stretch endlessly as every eye followed him through the silent ballroom. Clara sensed polished boots stop before her but could not gather enough strength to lift her head. Then, instead of anger or condemnation, a gloved hand appeared within her blurred vision, offered with quiet steadiness and unmistakable respect. Adrian spoke only 6 words, yet they carried through the motionless hall like the tolling of a cathedral bell. "Stand, Clara. You are not alone." The silence lingering through the ballroom felt heavier than the palace walls themselves. No violin dared resume its melody, no servant risked a single step, and no guest seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Clara stared at the hand extended before her, unable to believe the Duke himself was waiting patiently instead of ordering her away. Her fingers trembled as they reached toward his gloved palm. The moment their hands met, Adrian gently steadied her until she stood without haste, shielding her from the broken crystal scattered across the marble floor. A murmur swept through the assembled nobles. Some looked shocked. Others appeared offended. Lady Vivian struggled to maintain her graceful expression, though anger flashed unmistakably behind her eyes. Everything she had orchestrated was unraveling before hundreds of influential witnesses. Adrian released Clara's hand only after he was certain she could stand comfortably. His voice remained calm, yet every syllable carried quiet authority. "Is the child unharmed?" Clara swallowed, still shaken. "I believe so, Your Grace." "Believe is not certainty." She lowered her eyes. I think we are all right." Mrs. Holloway hurried forward with visible relief. "She should sit down immediately." Adrian nodded once. "Bring a chair." Several footmen hesitated, uncertain whether to obey the Duke or avoid becoming involved. One sharp glance from Adrian ended their uncertainty. A carved chair appeared within moments, and Clara carefully lowered herself into it while pressing both hands protectively over her stomach. The Duke remained beside her. That single choice unsettled the room more than any speech could have. Lord Edmund Blackwood stepped forward with practiced confidence. "Your Grace," he began smoothly, "surely this unfortunate disturbance should not overshadow such an important evening." Adrian looked at him without expression. The disturbance did not begin when the glass shattered. Lord Edmund offered a polite smile. "I merely meant the guests should return to enjoying the celebration." The celebration ended, Adrian replied evenly, when compassion left this room. No one answered. Even those who privately agreed with Lord Edmund found themselves unable to challenge the Duke's unmistakable disappointment. Vivian finally stepped forward, her voice gentle enough to disguise calculation. "My cousin, everyone was only attempting to lighten the mood. No lasting harm was intended." Adrian slowly turned toward her. "You call humiliation amusement?" Her smile faltered. "I simply believed." "I know exactly what you believed." Those words landed harder than any raised voice. Vivian realized she had never before seen Adrian look at her with such cold clarity. Thomas quietly entered carrying fresh flowers, only to stop when he recognized the tense silence filling the hall. His gaze settled upon Clara seated beside the Duke, and cautious hope flickered across his weathered face. Adrian addressed the entire ballroom. "I have watched servants labor from dawn until midnight preparing this evening." His eyes swept across the guests. "They carried your luggage. They prepared your meals. They polished every window, every staircase, every glass from which you now drink." He paused. "Yet some among you found pleasure in mocking a woman who has done nothing except endure hardship with grace." Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. No one laughed now. Clara wished she could disappear. Never had she wanted attention. She had only wanted honest work, safety for her unborn child, and enough peace to survive another day. Instead, every face in the grand ballroom seemed fixed upon her. Adrian noticed her discomfort. His voice softened. "You owe no explanation tonight." Those words nearly broke her composure. For months she had defended herself against whispers, accusations, and silent judgment. Hearing someone release her from that burden felt almost unbearable. Tears filled her eyes again. This time they were not born from humiliation. Mrs. Holloway discreetly handed Clara a clean handkerchief. "You've earned a moment to breathe," she whispered. Across the room, Vivian's thoughts raced desperately. If Adrian continued protecting Clara publicly, questions would inevitably arise. Questions about old records. About missing documents. About a soldier whose name had almost disappeared from memory. She could not allow that. Not after everything her father had sacrificed to keep the past buried. Lord Edmund sensed the same danger. He caught Vivian's eye only briefly before giving the slightest warning shake of his head. "Remain silent. For now." Adrian bent carefully beside Clara so only she could hear. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Will you trust me?" She searched his face, expecting pity. She found only respect. Very quietly, she nodded. He offered his arm instead of his hand, allowing her the dignity of choosing. After one hesitant breath, Clara accepted. Together they crossed the ballroom. No one moved aside because they were commanded. They moved because shame accomplished what authority never could. The scattered coins remained abandoned upon the marble floor. No servant rushed to collect them. No guest wished to claim them. They had become silent evidence of a room that had mistaken cruelty for elegance. Just before Adrian and Clara reached the great doors, an elderly footman hurried breathlessly into the hall carrying a weathered leather satchel dusted with snow. He bowed deeply before the Duke, then spoke words that instantly drained the color from Thomas's face. "Your Grace," he said, holding out the satchel with shaking hands, "a messenger arrived from the northern monastery. The monks said this belonged to Captain Nathaniel Hawthorne, and that it was to be delivered only if Clara Whitmore was ever found." Every conversation inside the ballroom dissolved into stunned silence as the elderly footman carefully placed the weathered leather satchel into Duke Adrian's hands. Time itself seemed to pause. Clara stared at the faded stitching, recognizing it instantly despite the passing years. Nathaniel had carried that satchel on the morning he rode away to war. She remembered fastening its worn buckle herself, laughing because he insisted it was lucky. She had never expected to see it again. Adrian looked from the satchel to Clara. "Is this truly his?" Her voice trembled. "Yes." The Duke gently broke the brittle cord securing the flap. Inside rested a folded military cloak, a small wooden cross, and a sealed envelope bearing Nathaniel's unmistakable handwriting. Across the front appeared only two names. "For Clara Whitmore. If Duke Adrian Ashcombe survives." Adrian closed his eyes briefly before opening the letter with careful hands. The ballroom remained perfectly still as he silently read the opening lines. Emotion flickered across his usually composed face. Without another word, he handed the letter to Clara. She unfolded the fragile pages. "My dearest Clara," she whispered aloud, barely able to breathe. "If these words ever reach you, then heaven chose a different road than the one we dreamed together. Never believe I abandoned you. I carried your love into every battle and spoke your name with my final prayers. Should our child enter this world without me, tell her that her father loved her before he ever saw her face." Tears streamed freely down Clara's cheeks. She continued reading. "Adrian, if you are reading this beside her, then you kept your promise to live. Now I ask for one more kindness. Protect Clara until she no longer needs protecting. She is stronger than anyone knows, but even the strongest hearts deserve someone who stands beside them." The final sheet slipped from the envelope. A neatly signed marriage certificate unfolded onto the polished floor. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Mrs. Holloway covered her mouth. Thomas quietly bowed his head in gratitude. Every cruel rumor collapsed beneath undeniable truth. Clara had never been abandoned. She had been a lawful wife mourning a fallen husband while carrying his child. Lord Edmund's face turned pale. Vivian's confidence shattered completely. Adrian slowly lifted the marriage certificate for everyone to see. This woman has been slandered by people who never cared to seek the truth. No one argued. No one dared. Vivian stepped forward, desperation replacing elegance. We never knew. Thomas finally spoke. You knew enough to invent lies. His calm words struck harder than accusation. The old gardener reached into his coat and withdrew another folded paper. I have guarded this since Nathaniel entrusted it to me before leaving for war. I feared no one would believe me without stronger proof. He handed it to Adrian. It was a legal record confirming that Clara's late father had left a modest estate to his only daughter. The official seal had been broken, and another name had been written across it before being scratched away. Lord Edmund lowered his eyes. His silence became confession. Adrian's disappointment deepened. You stole from a grieving widow. Lord Edmund found no answer. You permitted lies to destroy her reputation. Still no answer. And you stood silent while innocent people mocked her. The older noble's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of undeniable guilt. Adrian addressed the assembled guests. This evening was meant to celebrate privilege. He looked toward Clara. Instead, it has revealed character. Turning toward the palace guards waiting near the entrance, he spoke with unwavering authority. Escort Lord Edmund and Lady Vivian from Ashcombe Palace. Until a formal inquiry is completed, neither is welcome beneath this roof. The guards stepped forward. Vivian stared at Adrian in disbelief. You would disgrace your own family? He answered quietly. They disgraced themselves. Without another word, the guards escorted both nobles from the ballroom. No guest attempted to intervene. As the great doors closed behind them, an unexpected calm settled over the hall. Clara remained seated, overwhelmed by relief more than triumph. For years she had carried unbearable loneliness, believing the truth might never matter again. Now Nathaniel's honor had been restored before the very people who had mocked her. Adrian approached gently. You have endured more than anyone should. She looked up through grateful tears. I thought everyone would remember him as a stranger. They will remember him as a hero. At that moment the baby kicked strongly beneath Clara's hands. She laughed through her tears. I think she agrees. The simple sound transformed the room. Guests who had watched silently now lowered their heads in genuine shame. One elderly countess stepped forward first. Lady Clara, she said softly, I judged you without kindness. Please forgive an old woman who mistook gossip for truth. Another noble followed. Then another. One by one, apologies replaced whispers. Clara accepted each with quiet grace. I cannot change yesterday, she said, but I hope tomorrow will be kinder for someone else. Those words lingered longer than any accusation. Weeks later, beneath the first blossoms of spring, Ashcombe Palace welcomed a healthy baby girl into the world. Adrian waited outside Clara's chamber through every difficult hour, refusing food or rest until the midwife finally emerged smiling. A beautiful daughter. When Adrian entered the room, Clara placed the tiny child into his waiting arms. We named her Eleanor, she whispered. The infant wrapped impossibly small fingers around his thumb. For the first time since the war, Adrian felt the heavy burden inside his heart begin to lift. Months passed, and the restored inheritance allowed Clara to transform her family estate into a refuge for widows, orphan children, and injured veterans. Thomas tended gardens where hungry families gathered fresh vegetables. Mrs. Holloway oversaw classrooms instead of servants' quarters. Laughter slowly replaced sorrow. One golden afternoon, Adrian stood beside Clara beneath the same oak tree where she had once shared her supper with hungry children. Eleanor toddled through the grass chasing butterflies while village children played around her. Adrian offered Clara the restored wedding ring Nathaniel had cherished, fastening it once more upon the ribbon she wore close to her heart. Some loves are never replaced, he said gently. They are honored. Then he placed a second ring into her hand. If one day your heart chooses another beginning, it will always be your choice. Clara looked from the ring to the laughing child, then to the man who had never asked her to forget the past in order to embrace the future. With quiet certainty, she slipped the new ring beside the old one. Not replacing. Remembering. Beginning. As Eleanor reached for both their hands, they walked forward together beneath the warm spring sun, leaving behind a palace where cruelty had once echoed, and building a home where compassion would become the only legacy future generations would remember.